OR Manager is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Reclaim Your Most Valuable Asset, Converting Unused OR Time into More Cases, presented by Surgical Directions, a leading specialty healthcare consulting firm based in Chicago. My name is Iris, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Please note today's webinar is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulties with the web portion of the program, just email clientservices@accessintel.com. You can also refer to the links box located to the left of the screen, where you'll see a tech help overview. This presentation will last 45 to 60 minutes and will include question and answer opportunities at the end. Please know that you can submit a question to the left of the screen, where you'll see a tech help overview. This presentation will last 45 to 60 minutes and will include question and answer opportunities at the end. Please stand by. Can the speakers please mute their speaker line? Thank you. Sorry, we had some background noise right there. We'll continue on with the presentation. Again, this presentation will last 45 to 60 minutes and will include Q&A opportunities at the end. Just know that you can use your chat box at the left-hand side. You can submit a question at any time. Your questions will be received by me, and I'll field them, but please know they won't be visible to all attendees. As a final note, a copy of the slides will be made available to attendees after the event. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Brian Watha is Associate Vice President at Surgical Directions and is known for his extensive experience in OR process improvement and healthcare business intelligence. Michael Besdick is Engagement Manager at Surgical Directions, where he manages analytics projects to reduce costs, drive revenue, and increase ROI for healthcare clients. His specialties include analytics research, implementation, and strategy. Both speakers are dedicated to helping hospitals and ASCs achieve the absolute greatest impact and sustainable performance possible. We are pleased to have them here with us today. Brian and Michael, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Iris. So good morning or afternoon to all, depending on where you are today. I'm Brian Watha, and today my colleague and I will be covering an important topic, particularly in these times, reclaiming your most valuable asset, converting unused OR time into more cases. As Iris said, our agenda today is about 35 to 45 minutes of content, where we're going to really focus on engineering open time into your block schedule, holding surgeons accountable to responsible block use, managing scheduled procedure times with historical usage, creating a culture of organizational accountability, and then reserving about 15 to 20 minutes at the end, if not more, for Q&A, depending on what we have. We'll start with kind of a little case scenario. So many perioperative departments struggle to maximize their most important resource, which is operating room minutes. And knowing that, this OR manager, we're assuming that many people have experience with this. So, just kind of get a sense of this scenario sounds familiar. Having an OR that runs less than 65% overall utilization with an overall block utilization that trails that. You have surgeons that constantly complain they can't get access to their schedule, they can't get their cases on, and they're routinely throwing to take their cases across the street, and they're constantly knocking on the CEO's door, letting them know that that's what they're doing. Poor productivity combined with excess premium for staff, which increases your unit cost per case. Then you have inefficient scheduling and workflow processes that limit the total surgical capacity. Much of these are layered with politics, which only complicates things further. And this is particularly true with organizations that have poor data and poor processes. A common issue that we find for most healthcare organizations is really finding the right balance between appropriate surgeon access with reasonable productivity for the facility. We'll touch on it a little bit later as we kind of go through our presentation. So in order to better utilize the OR, hospitals really need to focus on how they can eliminate their key sources of waste. Now, we're really going to focus on kind of these four today. There's a lot more areas of waste that exist in the OR, but we kind of see these are the biggest bang for your buck. So one is looking at how blocked is your OR today. If you have 10 ORs, how many ORs am I actually blocking? actually holding surgeons accountable to either unused block time or poorly utilized time. And like we said before, scheduled procedure times that aren't tied to historical case duration, and then overall poor patient throughput. So with that, we're going to spend a little bit more time on just focusing on engineering open time into your block schedule. So many hospitals have almost all their daily OR time blocked, and I'll be frank, most of the places that Mike and I go to, one of the biggest challenges we see is, okay, of however many ORs you have, you're 90% blocked, 95% blocked. You know, the open time you have isn't even desirable. It's in the afternoon on a Friday afternoon, or it's, you know, Tuesday in the morning between 10 and 4. It's these really obscene times. It's because that open time is just what's left over after I block the rest of my OR. And most surgeons attempt to appease surgeon demand for access by providing surgeons block time. So going back to that kind of point we said before, that balance between access for surgeons versus, you know, reasonable productivity, you know, many times politics wins and we acquiesce and we give surgeons time, which further handcuffs our ability to grow, you know, because we've limited non-block surgeons' ability to get into our OR. And again, this is one of your most valuable resources, you know, so I think what we're finding now is, as opposed to giving surgeons block time, because we all know giving time is easy, taking it away is very hard, you know, so the paradigm is changing a little bit where we're looking to have surgeons earn that block time by scheduling into open time enough where we can see their usage on particular days deems block time in the future. A little more detail on this. So this is kind of a scenario, a visual aid of sort of the things we see. So here's a hospital with 10 operating rooms. You can see of their 10 operating rooms, all 10 of them are blocked. There's no room for urgent cases. There's no room for emergent cases. If you were a non-block surgeon in the scenario, you really don't have a place to schedule into. And beyond that, you can see kind of the add-ons that happen at the end of the day. You know, those typically end up being surgeons who, because they didn't have an ability to schedule electively into your OR, you know, are going to schedule cases within 2 or 3 days. You know, it was creating a whole slew of problems from a pre-AT perspective and a prior auth perspective, so on and so forth. You know, but it's because they never had a chance to schedule electively, so they're only forced to schedule in 2 or 3 days. You can kind of see of these blocks, some have short releases, some have long releases, but you know, again, in this world, I'm really handcuffing myself to be able to be thoughtful about how I schedule the OR and how I manage my caseload. In an ideal scenario, we would have taken at least 20% of your ORs and we would have actually had them as open time. Now, depending on your facility, if you have a lot of add-ons and a lot of emergent cases, you know, at times we would actually look into having a third room open and making that an add-on room, but it really depends on the nuances of your facility. But at least in this scenario, I've taken away the blocks of those surgeons who are underutilized. I have a place for elective surgeons to schedule electively, so I actually have a day for growth. And then through this, I also am able to have my urgent emergent cases kind of in a room where they're not being scattered throughout the place. This allows for more growth, and at the end of the day, it gives the non-block surgeons access to your OR where they wouldn't have if you had the entire OR blocked. So how do we start this, though? You know, I mean, typically we go into places, and let's just take the example we're looking at, 10 ORs. You know, we'll go to a place and say, really, you're running 7 rooms concurrently. You know, so we kind of get a deep analysis of historical utilization of the operating room. Instead of looking at the percent utilized, what we actually get a sense of is a 90%, 95% confidence rate of how many rooms you run concurrently at any given hour of the day, any day of the week. And that kind of starts our baseline. So if you're running, let's say, on a Thursday, 7 rooms of the 10, well, maybe that's our baseline. Maybe we start with those 7. And then from that, we take 20% of those 7, and we take that as open time. And that kind of gives us the world with which we can block, and then how much, and it gives us our time to, it gives us our reserve time for open time. But we need to start with this, kind of getting a lay of the land of, like, what are your hours of operation? How many rooms should you run at what hour of the day? You know, and then this kind of coincides with surgeon block patterns. You can kind of see maybe Thursday is a busier day. We run 6 rooms to 1,400. You know, if that's the case, maybe I actually have some blocks that are 10 hours as opposed to 8 hours, so on and so forth. So we take that heat map visualization we have in point 1, by the probability of rooms running concurrently by day of week and hour a day. We kind of look at anesthesia and OR staffing. We reconcile the anesthesia and the OR staffing aligned to kind of our heat map. Again, like I said before, we'll take that and we'll work with the organization again to get a sense of like, okay, of our hours of operation, how many rooms we want to reserve as open time. We'll work with the surgeons, kind of look at existing practice patterns. If the surgeon works a lot on Thursday, we're going to block that surgeon on Thursday. Typically, I find 20% of your surgeons do 80% of your volume. Now, if I can find a place for that 20% of the surgeons and make sure that I'm out baking in the home for 80% of my volume and I'm giving them adequate access, the rest of those surgeons who make up the other 20% of the volume should be able to work into open time. And if they really want to earn block time in the future, then it should be up to them to work typically on a particular day to earn that time and tell you, hey, I do about 4 cases every Tuesday. And that way when you're looking at utilization in the future, you have people who maybe earn block time from the people you would take it away from. But this world using historical utilization, using surgeon practice patterns, it allows us to right-size the OR in a way that makes sense, but also gives us a way to say, using data, using practice patterns, of building in the open time that's necessary for organization to grow appropriately. So now that we have this, we're in a world where I'm able to allocate the block. I'm able to build in open time. The trick here is making sure that those surgeons who are given block time are judicious with their block time. At the end of the day, we need to remember it is not Dr. X's room on Tuesday. It is the facility's room on Tuesday, and we're letting Dr. X work there, and it is up to them to be judicial with the time we're giving them. And that, again, is a paradigm shift because we are so often to acquiesce to give them access unnecessarily, but we need to really hold surgeons accountable. But what does that mean? And I think that of all the things we've seen recently, this block abandonment or this unused surgeon block time has been the biggest driver of underutilization or poor block utilization to date. So here's a scenario for a surgeon block or surgeon X. They have blocks on Monday, Tuesdays, and Fridays. You can kind of see that on Mondays, they are notoriously bad about releasing their block time. So they had 10 Mondays allocated. They worked 4 of those Mondays. They did not release 6. So 6 days went unused. Literally block allocated, surgeons had no cases. So the overall utilization on Monday was poor. And you can see on Tuesday, they didn't really manage their block appropriately. They had 2 days that went unused. But they did show for work on those other 8 days, and they did maintain their utilization thoughtfully, but Friday, for some reason, this surgeon is able to release their block. In this case, that proactive release of block, and let's just say the surgeon had a 1-week release. Typically, our expectation would be that if you're going to release your block to get credit towards utilization, you need to release at least 2 weeks out. That gives all my non-block surgeons, 2 weeks to schedule into a room that they didn't have access to before. So not only did I bake in open time through my redesign of the OR block, but by holding surgeons accountable to proactive release, I've added another way for non-block surgeons to add volume. And typically what we find is we actually market that open time or that release time. So we know that, let's just say in mid-November or let's say mid-December, I'm going to get some blocks from surgeon X. Depending on who we know has a backlog, we'll actually go to those clinics, go to those offices and say, hey, listen, on this day, we're going to have some time. Do you want to do 3 or 4 cases? So it's a great way to market, but, again, surgeons crave access. And if you're not holding them accountable to this, they're going to hold that block to the very last minute because they don't know if they're going to get a case. And it's not fair for them to hold on to the blocks to the very last minute if there are other surgeons who have cases ready and waiting to go. So this block abandonment or this unused block really restricts access for other surgeons and contributes to overall poor utilization. Now that said,
hey, Brian.
Yep. Sorry about that.
Hey, Brian, can I jump in? So the behavior that we commonly see around these abandoned blocks is, this is really just an illustrative example that you're seeing. Commonly, there would be consistent unused block days for a given surgeon or a given group. It's just a behavior that's difficult to wire out of the process. And unless you have both appropriate elective release times, maybe it's a week out, maybe it's 2 weeks advance notice, and appropriate automatic release times that you're working with your surgeons to coordinate based upon the needs of their specialty, that behavior kind of persists. And to Brian's point, having a contingency plan when you don't have those abandoned blocks and making sure that it happens with less and less frequency, make sure that your access, to your non-block surgeons is relatively consistent. longer release times, particularly for elective, like high elective specialties like ortho joints, for instance, bread and butter cases, maybe some ENT cases, will, give your organization a lot more access than they have today. But I think, a lot of surgeons will hold on to these resources like it's theirs and don't necessarily want to dole it out unless maybe they're in a group setting, for instance. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. No, I think another important part of this is, I'm sure, and Mike and I have dealt with this, we show surgeons their utilization data, and automatically it's wrong. And it's wrong because the surgeon, when he shows up, let's just say he worked 3 days in a month. If he worked 3 days but only showed up for 2, and those 2 days that he showed up or she showed up, they're 90% utilized. But that third day they didn't show up. Well, 90 and 90 is 180 plus 0 is 180 divided by 3. Your utilization is 60%. But that 0 doesn't reconcile because when they're in the OR, they are busy. Okay, and they're not looking that you're holding them accountable to that unused day. And that's when you get into the whole world where your data's wrong. Your numbers aren't accurate. And that kind of takes us to our next point. I'm trying to move it to the next slide. I'm sorry. Sorry, Iris, can you move to the next slide? Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Kind of takes us to our next point. It's that, you can have all the data in the world, but unless you have well-structured policies, such as proactive block release, like Mike was referencing, how do you actually facilitate the responsible use of the OR? And that really comes to, making allocation contingent upon responsible usage. So we actually not only hold surgeons accountable to 75% utilization, but we hold them accountable to 75% block maintaining. So if you're releasing more than 25% of your block time, that tells me that maybe you don't need 100% of your block. So we'll hold surgeons accountable to that as well. So when they're underutilizing their block, or they have or are at risk for having their time reduced, at least we actually have thoughtful metrics. And we have had these conversations with the facility, with surgeons at that institution, so we get some consensus and agreement on this is how we're going to measure utilization. This is how we're going to hold surgeons accountable. Without the data, you get into this very political world, and we find that in that political world, most organizations tend to acquiesce. Because without having the data, without having the policies to fall back on, the threats are there, and we don't want to lose a surgeon, so by default, we'll give them extra time, but we're not realizing we're just taking away access from other people. So automatic release time is a very contentious issue. We kind of look at surgeons' lead time for elective, cases, kind of get a sense of that. And then I think we talked about developing a system for informing surgeons about their upcoming available block time. Whether you're marketing open time, whether you're letting them know, whether or not you're letting them know new time is available, or really letting them know how well they're performing. We tend to have, not just the quarterly review, but once those blocks are at risk, we'll have monthly conversations with those at-risk blocks. But again, it requires that the institution has consensus and agreement around the metrics that we're holding surgeons accountable to. Because that deflates and that takes away a lot of the politics and a lot of the noise.
And Brian, so, I want to raise. Sorry to interrupt. I want to raise an important point that you mentioned previously. In addition to the sort of surprise that comes when you hand data, particularly when they're abandoning blocks, it's showing up lower than they would expect. The other two things we think it's important to track is their out-of-block time and their non-block time. So that out-of-block time would be the time that they're operating over their block and on a day where they're allocated. So, for instance, they may book that additional add-on that goes above their block time. Not great in terms of the premium time that you have to pay for it, but that's still value-add time to them, that they still perceive themselves as busy and contributing to the organization. The other thing that occurs is they'll book a case, if they can, they'll book a case on a day where they don't necessarily have block. And that's time that doesn't necessarily count toward block utilization, and it shouldn't, because block utilization, that's sort of the goalpost, and it's outside the goalpost. But they still see that as value add to the organization because they're bringing they're choosing your organization, they're bringing cases there. So what we found to be effective is, the narrative is, your utilization isn't necessarily where you think it should be, but here's all your non-block minutes that you're doing regularly on a day where you don't have block. And if it starts, bumping into a level where maybe they should have block time, that's a consideration that helps, solidify their notion that they're providing value to the organization. So it's not necessarily great from a predictability standpoint, but it is a way to improve your case volume, and it is a way to kind of, build a sandbox around time that is being and that you are paying for. So something to keep in mind.
No, and I'm glad you brought that up, and I kind of because it's really important. When you have a crucial conversation with a surgeon who's maybe at risk for losing block because they're 60% utilized, but there's 2 days that went unused that they could have provided through release, and then there's a bunch of cases on Thursday that they should have done on Wednesday that would have put them over the hump. Having that conversation helps course correct how their practice patterns, and lets them have crucial conversations internally with their clinic as to how, that they need to be more judicious about how they're scheduling. And the other part of it is when it comes to open time, for us, the people who get priority access to open time are non-block surgeons. So that's another thing we try to work into. That is, if I'm looking at surgeon X versus surgeon Y, and surgeon Y doesn't have block time, well, I'm going to prioritize surgeon Y, even if surgeon X requested earlier, because surgeon X has block time to put cases in. Particularly if surgeon X's block is full, and this is an emergent case, or this is a case that really has happened. Obviously there's exceptions, but you really want to prioritize that open time for non-block surgeons because that's your way to grow as an institution.
And I think a strategy to continue prioritizing non-block surgeons is to consider lengthening blocks for surgeons that are appropriately utilized and have non-block time. Oftentimes, particularly surgeons that operate at multiple facilities, they may be choosing your organization because, they like their staff team, or, it's easy to get their case on into their block time, or they have more access than they do versus another institution. What we've seen be effective in growing case volume, particularly for surgeons that do use the operating room well, is lengthening block times from 8 hours to 10 hours, for instance. And there are staffing implications, but the net effect of that additional case has pretty profound financial impact. You're pretty much getting guaranteed growth, so long as you have appropriate use. So that's another kind of tool you have in your toolbox is changing your block lengths to accommodate those practice patterns, especially if they're, if they can't traditionally book into a shorter block, they're doing cases on non-block days. You pull them in and see if they can consolidate their volume into 1 day and be more vertical in that instance.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's another important way for us to kind of get surgeons to work on their days. When we do this whole re-engineering of the OR, part of the things we promise them, or something we try to work through when we redo the staffing is, again, if 20% of the surgeons make up 80% of the volume and I can block them appropriately, the objective is to make sure that they have their team. As much as possible, like anesthesia and nursing teams, so on and so forth, it makes their day feel better. And if I can get surgeons to, if I can do that for them and say, all right, listen, you're telling me that you can't schedule a third case because it goes beyond your 8 hours and the hospital won't let you do that. I'm going to give you a 10-hour block, and we're going to extend the staff shifts, so that way you have your team the entire time, so that at 3 o'clock you don't feel this changeover of staff and you feel like this whole slow day occur at the end of the hour, end of the day. We do a lot of that to make sure that, again, we're not trying to punish our surgeons. We want to make things as efficient as possible, but we can't make things efficient if we're just doling out block to people who aren't going to use it appropriately. So I guess with that, I'm going to probably hand over to Mike. We're going to go into a couple other things. Mike is a master of the scheduled procedure versus royalty usage. Mike, you want to dig into this?
Sure. So, this is one of actually the forces that are running counter to some of the things that Brian mentioned earlier, and that is, finding a way to change the behavior that we see a lot of surgeons have, particularly when they feel like their access is limited, to making sure that their procedures are going to take as long as they're expected to. And what we mean by that is that, there's wide variability even for a given procedure. Maybe it's a knee or a shoulder scope, for instance, or, a scheduled C-section. There's oftentimes this perception that surgeons say that they're faster than they really are. They're not necessarily paying attention to all of the intraoperative processes that are occurring. And, they view their time in the OR as their gloves on. They do the procedure, their gloves come off, they go, somewhere else, have a long turnover, but they were in and out in 60 minutes, when in reality, the procedure from the time the patient got into the room to the time the patient left was 2 hours. There are a lot of contributing factors to that, but as you're scheduling, you should base that on historical time and historical usage, regardless of, with some exceptions of surgeon influence throughout that process. So, one of the things we've seen historically is Olympic average time, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But there's another data quality issue that often comes into play here, and that is migrating or integrating with antiquated EMRs where the master procedure file isn't necessarily linked up. There's a lot of additions, like maybe you have different case times based on laterality that are contributing to wide variation and differences. Like all of these things can contribute to variability in your schedule and can make you either run way longer than you need to, by the time, you get through all your cases for the day, or things aren't matching up, and you end up with limited access to, someone that was expecting to get their add-on following this previous surgeon doesn't end up happening. So there's so many things that can happen here. There's the data challenge. There's the political challenge of making sure that these are accurate from surgeon to surgeon as they book. So, like I mentioned before, this Olympic average it's a form of truncated average where you look at the previous 10 procedures that were performed, the time of the previous 10 procedures that were performed. You remove the high and low values, take the mean of that value. And this is pretty common. Most EMRs have this functionality built in. And this is commonly what we use in order to forecast blocks, to kind of understand demand. I think the effect of doing this is to reduce the outliers that occur and also bias your sample more toward recently performed cases. But a lot of times, like I mentioned, making sure that data quality is in place is not always the top priority. And your schedulers don't necessarily have insight. They're just trying to get cases booked, particularly in centralized environments. If you're not specialized, in understanding the needs of a certain specialty, this can be a really difficult process. So what we see is, you need to set up a few lines of defense to make sure that your schedule is rational going into the day. So what we've done is taken these Olympic average times for your high volume surgeons, and particularly put a lot of effort into the surgeons that try to have influence or say in how long their cases are going to take, take their top 10 procedures by volume, have a conversation with them, and then empower the schedulers with this data so that when the surgeon's office calls and they say, oh, it's going to take this long, have a historical case record saying, we're going to book it for this long, And if that fails, having a multidisciplinary daily huddle that's reviewing these cases 3 to 5 days out. And typically, the most effective multidisciplinary huddles have physician leadership, typically an anesthesiologist that runs the board. And this person can have a conversation with the physician if they're chronically trying to alter their times just so they can book that extra time in the day. We found that this is sort of an appropriate control. But you can't catch everyone. So, the final step is to have a peer-to-peer conversation with surgeons that review the time, making sure that you're not constantly scheduling out late into the right, which causes staff retention issues. It causes other cultural issues. The most important part is you have this empowered body that's going to hold surgeons accountable to making sure that their scheduling practices are in place. This is an important thing because block time is so highly coveted. People will try and capture as much of that time as possible. The unfortunate result of this kind of avarice kind of forces other surgeons out of your operating room, particularly ones that you're trying to get, help them build their practice and build a presence at your organization. So,
Mike, I just want to piggyback on what you were mentioning about the procedure file, because that is like, and I'm sure anyone here who's working in scheduling or working in most places inherited what their procedure description or their procedure dictionary from their existing system when they migrated to EMRs. And not many places went through a process of actually thoughtfully cleaning up their procedure dictionary, making sure that the procedures make sense. A level 2 versus a level 4 lumbar laminectomy are completely different in terms of case duration, but are exactly the same in preference card management. So from a preference card and a procedure dictionary perspective, having some governance or some controls around that is really important too if your focus is having more predictability in your schedule.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brian. And I think the last place that we're going to touch on today focuses around creating a culture of organizational accountability, really focused on patient throughput, process improvement, and efficiency. And we think that this is one of the key areas that is well known, highly discussed, but overlooked in terms of how processes are choreographed to make sure that you're starting and ending on time. It's really as simple as that. So you've optimized your block. You've done everything you can to provide open time to surgeons so they can get on the schedule better. But lackluster patient preparation and operational inefficiencies like long turnovers are still going to preclude surgeons from booking, at your facility. So, insufficient patient preparation like missing labs, no consents on the day of surgery, poorly optimized patients. I mean, there may be clinical reasons for some of these things, like needing a more recent test, for instance, but this is a huge driver of inefficiency, particularly in the mornings. And what results from that is this culture of, well, my room isn't ready, why should I show up on time? Which drives that kind of negative behavior. And if you look at an actual room with a long first case on time start delay, and long turnovers, that can mean, an additional case won't fit into that block time that you have staff for, which is an issue. So slow turnover time is one of those other things, like, developing a culture with kind of an ASC mindset. Everyone is integrated as a part of the turnover. Everyone is prepared for the turnover. And there are issues that crop up that prevent this, but having swim lanes and conversations with staff about what needs to get done during that turnover from one case to the next, what you can do to prepare, to make sure that your turnovers go efficiently, comes down to scheduling, comes down to preparation, comes down to materials, and having an understanding of what needs to get done. These are all factors that I think even after you have brilliant block design or brilliantly engineered block access for surgeons are still, going to be important as you think about having available time in your schedule. So some of the things that I mentioned earlier, just addressing this block utilization isn't enough to necessarily always book that additional case or, give that surgeon with block time that additional case that they desire to have in their block. Building dedicated swim lanes for turnover and for first case on time starts. We would recommend piloting with one high volume surgeon or service line, particularly one that is maybe skeptical of the process. If they see that, oh my gosh, my turnovers are so quick now. I need to book in another case to keep my block time. That will resonate within your organization. Holding surgeons accountable to your first case on time starts. This is often seen as maybe a ticking time bomb, but what we found to be effective is using data to identify the chronic offenders. Posting late arrival information in the surgeon's lounge, for instance. It's not necessarily always going to work. Usually, we would recommend a conversation, with surgeons beforehand. But this is effective at driving behavioral change. No one wants to be a frequent offender. And then, another
Mike,
point sorry, go ahead.
Just to piggyback, I think the other part of because you're talking about like the swim stuff, it's also really important that that governance body that we establish, sets the rules of engagement. It's hard for us or anybody to tell a surgeon to show up on time. But if you have a group of high performing surgeons, leadership, and other OR administrators, who have kind of set the rules of engagement, it's easier to highlight frequent offenders and then have, hold the governing body accountable to managing those people who are maybe the frequent offenders, as opposed to us just chasing them down. So I think, leveraging your governance body, when it comes to physician behaviors is critical.
Absolutely. Yeah. And finally, this multidisciplinary huddle is extremely effective in capturing these issues proactively. And, oftentimes someone from scheduling will be a part of that multidisciplinary huddle, has a relationship with surgeon offices, and can help kind of coordinate more efficient patient preparation. A lot of times there's breakdown in communication just with the hospital and the surgeon's office, not really knowing specifically what is needed for the surgery to happen, what the appropriate workup is. Maybe they don't have as good of a relationship with the referring PCP. All of these are sort of intricately linked, but if they're not synergized, will lead to patient preparation delays. So again, not necessarily exactly related to block time, but will not enable you to maximize your use of a well-designed block if these things are also not in place. So, to kind of summarize, these four factors are this intricate web of processes that need a lot of dedication, a lot of time, but the time invested in these activities are going to get you back capacity that you need to grow your operating room. Looking into engineering time, open time into your block schedule, holding surgeons accountable to the time that you've given them, making sure that there's appropriate scheduling behavior, something as simple as making sure you have a good understanding of how long certain procedures are going to take, and then understanding patient throughput and patient preparation all will lead to increased capacity for growth. We've seen this time and time again with almost everywhere that we've gone. I remember anecdotes from surgeons, after starting these turnover time pilot programs, starting these patient preparation programs, coming to me saying, I need to book another case now in my block because my turnovers are so quick. I'm not going to have 75% utilization unless I book another shoulder arthroscopy, for instance. So these are all the things that are going to help drive the performance of your organization. I think this illustration shows it all. It's two scenarios, one of which has a delay in the morning, a few cases throughout the day in a given room, slow turnovers in between each case with one appropriate turnover, and all of a sudden you're bumping over your block time, versus the other scenario where you're starting your day on time, you have quick turnovers throughout the day, which gives you enough time to book an entire extra case in the same amount of time that it took to run the first one. This will have a dramatic effect, and you won't necessarily see this on every given day in every room in your OR, but it has a profound effect that, depending on the kind of cases that you're booking in that room, can have in excess of $800K roughly to $1.2 million per year. So it's not insignificant, particularly in hospitals that are running in very thin margins. So something to consider. So with that said, I think we're ready to field some questions, unless, Brian, you have any other concluding thoughts?
No, I think you covered it, Mike, pretty well.
Thank you, Brian and Michael. That's right. So to our attendees, as you heard, we're ready to take some questions from you. As a reminder, just use the chat box in the lower left corner to submit your question. They won't be visible to other attendees, but will be received. And Michael and Brian have generously offered to follow up by email if we don't have time to get to everybody's questions today. So let's start us off. We have a question from an attendee. How does the release block time impact support staffing, and what have you done to support this change in staffing?
So I guess if it's the proactive block release, okay, versus the natural block release. The natural block release would be, let's say I'm a total joint room and the expectation is, or let's say a bariatric room and the block release is 2 weeks. It's a natural release. If you don't have something scheduled in that room 2 weeks out, the block goes to the hospital. We do what we want to do. The proactive release would be, the surgeon knows they have nothing scheduled or they're going to be on vacation, so they release that block proactively. We give them credit for it. So when it comes to a staff perspective, if I have block time and I don't anticipate it's going to be filled, so let's say they release time because it's a Friday after Thanksgiving. If we don't anticipate that it's going to be filled, we will shift down or staff down, maybe to shut those rooms down, those sort of things. If there's an expectation or anticipation that there is a backlog of volume from other surgeons, we will market those release rooms to those surgeons. A lot of times, a lot of places we go to, surgeons that, especially for places that are overblocked, surgeons who request cases into like a Thursday, 2 weeks from now, they're essentially told you have to wait until a block is released. So a lot of places we go to, there's almost a backlog per day. And they're waiting for the block released, and then go to those surgeons and say, oh, we just got a Thursday now. I can schedule these 4 cases for you. Now, the problem is that surgeons don't want to wait 2 weeks out, especially if they're scheduling a month in advance, to know whether or not they have access to a schedule. So I think that's kind of the way we manage it. It's really kind of dependent on the anticipation of whether you have enough backlog cases to fill those rooms. I hope that answered your question.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, let's take some more questions. Talk more about the Olympic average and historical times of procedures that have multiple CPT codes or are commonly done in pairs, like mastectomy with reconstruction.
Yeah, it's a complicated problem. I mean, it is very challenging. There is a lot of combo procedures that exist out there. Some places actually would do Olympic averages for commonly combo procedures. So mastectomy reconstruction is a very common combo procedure. So sometimes you'll actually get Olympic average on that procedure or that combo. It's hard to do things where it's like a radical neck dissection with free flap or something like that, where it's these one-off procedures that happen with ENT and plastics. They do it maybe once every 6 months. You're really not going to build for those type of combos. And if you don't have enough counts of those cases, the reality is you're not going to have an Olympic average. So I think those cases where you have enough occurrences of those combo procedures, you may want to start looking at the Olympic average. And some EMRs actually do offer that functionality. They actually have the functionality if you have these 2 procedures scheduled together often enough, they can give you a Olympic average for those 2 procedures. Now, it depends on the EMR. But I think that goes back to the conversation we had about whether or not you want to have your procedure dictionary. Something like that is something that, do you have the reconstruction and then do you have the mastectomy as 2 different procedures and then you add them together? Do you have a mastectomy with reconstruction? Some of those things are really also going to impact billing, so I would also include them into how you want to manage those things. But, I mean, again, it's not really a direct answer, but I would say that it is a challenge for any combo procedure getting an Olympic average. I really only focus on those where we actually have enough count of those type of combo procedures to do.
Okay, thank you. Next question. what are you seeing for auto release times, 7 days versus 10 or 14 days?
It depends on the service. I mean, vascular services that have a lot of add-ons the next day, it might be short. Cardiac services that do a lot of add-ons, so it depends on the facility. I mean, I've gone to organizations where they have an entire ortho trauma service. So maybe the trauma service, the ortho trauma has a 1-day release. Total joints has 2 weeks. Sports medicine has 7 days. Now, we get pretty granular about the different service lines because of how they schedule. I'm not going to tell somebody who does a lot of urgent cases because that's the nature of their service. If you're like a trauma hand person, nobody is going to wait next week if they have a mangled hand. Like, they're going to want it done tomorrow. So we try to work with the respective services to get a sense of how they schedule today, and then see what makes sense. Now, and then we'll challenge. A lot of these things are elective cases that should be done further out, particularly from a prior auth PAT perspective. We will challenge on those. But if the nature of your service is dealing with, urgent cases, things that you saw in your clinic that need to get done right away, those are the sort of things that we'll work with those surgeons. But, again, I think the challenge is making sure you have the appropriate governance to to negotiate those sort of things. It's not up to us. It's up to the governing body of that institution, when it comes to the OR. We'll present different options, and they'll make the best determination for their institution.
Something that we didn't mention with respect to that is actually developing lead time metrics, so understanding basically how surgeons schedule and the amount of time in days each surgeon has, their block fully scheduled, or the time it takes them to schedule each incremental case. And then from that, depending on the cases that are in that block, understanding, given a certain amount of time out, maybe it's 10 days, maybe it's 5 days, maybe it's 3 days or 2 days, what proportion of their cases have been scheduled within that window. And that will help you drive an understanding around what that automatic release time needs to be. I think in order to be more equitable, you have to probably, design releases down to the subspecialty level, like Brian mentioned, or the specialty level, just so there's equity or parity, within that subspecialty in terms of getting into the OR. But data will help you understand what kind of lead time is appropriate and therefore release time is appropriate.
Yeah. And not to belabor this, but I will say that one thing that we do find is, if I have a surgeon who is 75, 85%, I usually go to 85%. If they're 85% utilizing their block, I have a lot of confidence, especially with measuring accurately, that they're going to fill their time. And so we do offer at particular places, a shorter release for those surgeons who are very strong block utilizers, because we already anticipate that they're going to continue with that utilization. But if you're 65 to 75% utilized, giving you a shorter release, I still have uncertainty as to whether or not one day I'm going to have 80% utilization and then one day I'll have 50%. So we tend not to offer that shorter release unless you get to a higher level of utilization.
Okay, very good. And that actually might answer another question from some attendees about when should the block time be released. Or is there more you want to add?
I think we kind of cover that. We slice and dice it. It depends on the service line, the surgeon, how they schedule, those sort of things. And then typically when it comes to proactive release, we start with things being a little bit looser. So maybe we start with maybe double your natural release. So let's say a surgeon had a 5-day block release. So, then maybe we say you need to release your time 10 days out. Sometimes we just go with a 2-week block release to get credit. It really depends on what the natural release is. But those two are really important. And then as we get tighter, because again, if someone has a 5-day block release and you release it 5 days and 1 hour before, you're still not giving me enough time. If you have a 2-day release, you're releasing it 3 days out, you're not giving enough time. You should only get credit at a certain level of being proactive. And I think the sophisticated organizations start to push that data out further to hold their surgeons more accountable.
And the other thing to keep in mind, too, is if patients are coming to your institution to receive testing before surgery, if they're coming within a 72-hour window, you can't charge them, all of those tests are bundled into the surgical DRG that they're about to have. So, something to keep in mind from a, fiduciary perspective, if there's a lot of last-minute testing within 72 hours, that's money you're leaving on the table organizationally.
That's a great point, Mike. And those patients are with a lot of testing before surgery. I mean, those are the ones you typically end up having delays on because we scheduled them so short notice, and we didn't really have enough time to prep them up for the procedure the way we needed to.
Okay, excellent. So this attendee is referencing one of the last sentences or comments you made during the presentation about running on thin margins and asking if you could speak to block considerations with respect toward procedure and surgeon profitability, i.e. reimbursement.
Oh, that's a great question, and it's something that we try to. So functionally, I can't economically credential a surgeon. I cannot say because you make more money than surgeon X that, I can reduce your utilization threshold. We establish rules for block, and they tend to be economically neutral. Now, that being said, we know which services provide appropriate revenue for the facility. We do work with the institution to kind of get a sense of strategically what do you want to move into. You do a lot of self-pay plastics. I hear you want to move into more orthopedics. So when we look at the block redesign, we do layer in strategy, and growth and what functionally we're looking to go into, and that's the other reason why you don't want to overblock your OR, because if you want to grow into bariatrics and you hire some bariatric surgeons, it's going to take a while for them to get their volume up. But you do want to know that in 6 months from now, you're going to have a couple of rooms available for these surgeons so you can actually recruit them. I would say when it comes to blocking, we do know who's profitable, who's not, but I guess we really can't take that into consideration when we're actually doing the blocking. We do know behind the scenes that we take that into consideration from a strategy perspective, but we do need the hospital to tell us that these are the areas we want to grow into, so that way it doesn't look as if we're economically credentialing block holders, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think fundamentally the most important thing is that you block based on actual usage, and you have similar, if not the same exact goals across the board. And an orthopedic surgeon that's doing a ton of joints versus an ophthalmologist, if they're both at 60% utilization, they're both going to get a letter, saying that they're at risk of losing their block. So I think you get into very dangerous territory and try not to, economically credential, as Brian mentioned. I think it's more of a pattern matching exercise, understanding the patterns, designing a schedule that matches those patterns as well as you can, and making sure that your goals are similar for everyone that's going to use the resource that you're providing.
I will add, though, I will tell you that, and I was at a facility when I first started doing this. We were a quaternary facility, and we were doing cataracts, and, I needed room for neurosurgery. Obviously, the one makes more money than the other, and I didn't really, as an organization, we didn't really feel that, doing cataracts in the quaternary facility was an appropriate place of care for those patients. So those are the other things to consider is, the appropriateness of care, where should these procedures be done, and then what do I want to reserve for ROR? I think a lot of times I find places are reactive to the surgeons that are willing to do work at their facility and don't spend enough time strategically thinking about, what type of volume they want there and, regionalization of resources, regionalization of services, what cases do we do? That's a world I think places are just starting to delve into.
Okay, good. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So regarding accurate data collection and so forth, this attendee is wondering how to overcome surgeons' protest that the data may be wrong.
That's kind of what me and Mike live with. At the end of the day, I'll tell you, when I started doing this, I bore them with methods. I would walk through how I got to my number. I'd show every inflation that I created just to make sure that I accounted for all the things that I already knew they would be concerned about. So we would really be methodical, and then we would actually get some champions from the hospital who are prominent physicians who have enough political capital to say, no, it's right. If I'm going to sit there and just have a conversation with the surgeon and try to convince them the data is right one-on-one, it's going to be difficult. If I have a physician champion or some other leader who has enough political capital to say, we've walked through these numbers, they are accurate, and even within some margin of error, they're accurate within 3%. They're still directional enough to make the decisions we're making. So I think it's important that, you don't have that battle one-on-one with a surgeon. You really need to have a peer, a surgeon peer or some type of peer with that physician, who believes in the numbers, understands how we got to it, can explain it, in case that one of us isn't around. And I think that once you start getting enough people adopting the data, some of those voices start to quell, because then they're the outliers who are saying the data's wrong when the rest of the organization is actually making decisions on it.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that, physicians and most everyone that works in healthcare has a scientific background, and, a healthy level of skepticism is to be expected. Something that we touched on earlier is accounting for all of the time that these surgeons spend in the OR. I think it's Brian and our opinion that block utilization isn't always the whole story, and it's almost guaranteed that you're going to get pushback, particularly from surgeons that maybe don't have a full understanding of how this block management system works. So it comes down to methods. It comes down to designing an intervention thoughtfully with peers, and getting proponents of changes to make sure that the system runs well. Surgeon champions will help drive that process.
And I guess I'll only add that some surgeons get what they want by yelling. Some people want predictability and they want structure. So you really want to make sure that you get those surgeons who want predictability and structure to be kind of your advocate, because they're the ones who can actually challenge those louder surgeons who, no matter how accurate the data is, they're just not going to believe it because they want what they want.
Okay, let's get one more question in there. Kind of looking at the other direction. This attendee says, leadership does not want to book any cases until prior authorization is approved. How do you consider mitigate that upstream delay, assigning, measuring block time?
I mean, I would agree with leadership that, so it's not that I wouldn't book cases until the prior auth is achieved. I guess the question is how far in advance, and then how long does your prior auth process take? Typically what we would do is we would find, and going back to the huddle that Mike referenced 3 days out, we would actually look 3 days out and do we have a prior auth? And if we don't, that case is scheduled or going to be rescheduled. And we will have crucial conversation, and we'll escalate with, the RCM team and the physician's office. So we would typically schedule the case, but we do have a daily huddle where, and we're looking for the next 3 days, 3 to 5 typically. Do we have prior auths? Are there any concerns from a PAT perspective? Are there any issues with equipment? Do I have any loaner trays I need to worry about? Is this patient coming from a nursing home? Are the case durations accurate to what we anticipate? Like, we have all that proactive management a couple days out. So it's not as if I wouldn't schedule a case that didn't have a prior auth. I would, but I would also make sure that I'm managing it and that we're escalating. But again, we need the authority to say that if this case doesn't have prior auth by this day, we have the authority to reschedule. And again, we get that authority by governance. If I did it independently, that surgeon's going to get frustrated and get upset. Well, no one told me, this and that. I mean, we need to have that ability to, be able to do things. But again, we need to be empowered by our governance body to be able to do those things.
Yeah, and something I'll add is, denials management is a huge area of opportunity for a lot of institutions, and particularly institutions with a heavy contingency of employed surgeons who are compensated based on an RVU model, not necessarily a private pay model. the surgeons, it makes no difference whether there's prior auth or not. They get the RVUs, they've done the case functionally. So, that is definitely a challenge. So you have to align incentives there, and you have to have the appropriate controls in place to make sure that, these cases aren't getting denied, and you're essentially using labor time that is not netting you any revenue.
Okay, excellent. I think we ended on some good positive notes of empowerment and controls. So we're at the top of the hour. Thank you again, Brian and Michael. Thank you to our attendees and for their great questions. And with that, we will be concluding today's program. The final reminder, this session has been recorded. You can access the recorded archive by using the same login information you used for today's live webinar. Wishing everyone a good afternoon, and you may now disconnect.
Thanks, Iris. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.